What Fandom Racism Looks Like, Power and Privilege. Stitch's Media Mix. The project so far. I started my What Fandom Racism Looks Like essay project back in February 2018 after coming across two stories written to tear down Shuri and Wakandans right before Black Panther was released that year. I was watching fans, including other Black fans, bend over backwards to reframe Wakanda as problematic and Shuri as a Mary Sue they couldn't support. And I had to write something. So I did. Here I am, over a year later, with the first video project for this series identifying what fandom racism looks like under my belt. Privilege is something too many people in fandom try to pretend they don't have. When you bring up racism in fandom, one of the quickest denials is that the fans in question can't be racist because they're actually marginalized. These fans are marginalized or otherwise vulnerable in one way or another outside of fandom. They're women, they're queer, they're disabled, they're trauma deciders, survivors, or they're poor, all of which removes the potential for them to be racist, especially to/about Black fans, performers, and characters. And so they believe that they can't have privilege within fandom, even as they use their privilege against other people in fandom who are in the way of them enjoying their fandom experience without having to think critically about any aspect of fandom. In the past 6 months, I've seen three different, possibly all white women with larger following counts than I have on any of my platforms use their positions as freelancers or staff writers at The Nerdist and The Mary Sue to write posts about how important their aspect of fandom is and how criticizing it goes against the very nature of fandom and is, in essence, an attack on women in fandom. In June, we had Women Who Love Kylo Ren silenced on The Nerdist. In September and October, we had two separate articles on the Mary Sue that kind of poked at the idea that anyone critical of fandom had to be doing it because they really hated fandom, that they really hated women. And it's very frustrating that it looks as though the Mary Sue's editorial staff or whoever handles what articles go where don't seem capable of understanding nuances of fandom or capable of sniffing out grudges from people in fandom, because both of those articles are petty. They are the fandom wank they claim to be pushing back against, and that the Mary Sue doesn't have anyone capable of recognizing that is a bit worrying, and they should work on that. So Lindsay Romaine was the first of the three that I listed. Lindsay wrote an article about Kylo Ren and fallen heroes and redemption arcs. And so in this tweet that's screenshot, she says, "I did this for the women in the Star Wars community who have long felt silenced for holding the same beliefs." Lindsay Romaine's article about Kylo Ren and how he deserves redemption as a fallen hero is annoying enough on its own. But then there's this tweet where she claims that she wrote her post because of the women who in the Star Wars fandom who are silenced for believing these things. As someone who's had many of these women silence them or attempt to silence them and their friends, and who's been framed as a threat to fandom despite not having a massive following, I call bullshit on that one. But how about this? Imagine saying that you're silenced while you tweet to your 13,000 followers about the article you got paid to write for The Nerdist. Imagine that. And then back to back between September and October, we had two separate instances of authors writing for the Mary Sue showing their butts and using that site's massive platforms to react to and punch down at smaller platformed artists and fans. In September, you had Jessica Mason's "What You Ship Doesn't Make You a Bad Person or a Good One." This one linked to an article by a Twitter user who I'm friends with. She has under 300 Twitter followers. It ignored the actual critique that this user was making and sent criticism and ending up abuse that way, their way. So this was a smaller following blog, and this person used the Mary Sue and the privilege of writing for the Mary Sue to aim harassment their way and didn't actually engage with the argument. So it's actually a bad faith argument, which makes the October article that I'm annoyed about just as hilarious, because this is also a bad faith argument attack, I mean. But this was stop with the bad faith attacks on the archive of our own. This post pretends that all criticism of the archive exists in bad faith and that no one has any reason or right to critique the supposedly sacred. So yeah, while the September post is especially galling because it does involve a bitter Ray Kylo shipper using her status for the Mary Sue to directly shuttle abusive shippers, and I use that word because of how they swarmed towards a blog post written by someone with a tiny amount of followers. I am especially annoyed at the October one because the author seems as if she wrote it based on tweets I had made earlier that day. Coincidences happen, but I made tweets about the archive's whack and weak offensive content policy at 8 a.m., and a post goes live at 4 p.m. that in part mocks the idea of caring about the offensive content policy because it's a free service and whatnot. I am not lucky enough to deal in coincidences. And the thing is that the people who keep framing me in particular as having some overwhelming power to force people to change their point of view in fandom all have access to audiences way larger than I do. But they insist on writing articles about how oppressed they are because a few folks in fandom aren't satisfied with the fandom status quo. For sites that have tens of thousands of followers. Wild. Here's a fun fact for you folks in fandom. The person using their position as a writer for sites like The Nerdist or the Mary Sue to write anything about their fandom fascination isn't actually a person that's bereft of power in fandom. By virtue of being paid to share their opinions with an audience of tens of thousands at minimum, they wield power in fandom. And they tend to use that power against marginalized fans in fandom who are critical of fandom's issues.